Hello, I'm Jane Barrett at the Career Farm, and this is episode 92 of the Career Farm podcast, Grow Your Own Career. The Grow Your Own podcast is sponsored by Career Maximizer, an online course I've developed to help you take charge of your career. The course takes you step by step through the process of deciding on your next career move and how to successfully market yourself to employers. No more confusion, no more guessing. It's based on 18 years of tried and tested career advice, which will give you the clarity and the confidence you need to stand out to recruiters. If you'd like to find out more, head over to careermaximizer.com. Hello and Happy New Year! I'm delighted to have a really interesting person on our podcast today. He's written a book called Employee to Entrepreneur, and basically it's the book I wish I'd read before I'd set up my own business nearly 20 years ago. Basically, it distills all the books that Steve's read, all the experience he's had of setting up several businesses, and it just would really have been very useful to know some of the pitfalls. And there are so many business books, you could spend ages reading them all. And so it's really useful to have them distilled into one book. And so you can really understand if you want to learn more, you can go and read other books that he references. But just to get an overview of all the things you need to think about when you're thinking of moving from corporate to doing your own thing. So I think this is really, really useful. I think for some people it isn't the right thing to leave corporate, and he very much covers that in the book. So I'm really delighted to have Steve on the podcast. He's dialing in from Brisbane in Australia, which is really exciting. He's on his book tour. It launches today, which is the 9th of January, which is my birthday. So he's going to be a very successful book. I'm very sure of that. And we're going to give away a copy of Steve's book. And I will tell you about how to claim that book after we've had the interview. So let's speak to Steve. His name is Steve Glaveski. And again, the book is Employee to Entrepreneur. And I'm just really delighted to have him on the show and for me to interview him for you. Okay, let's go. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. So you're in Lisbon at the moment on your book tour. So how far are you on the book tour? Have you just
Well, I'm actually in Brisbane, but I can see how you thought I said Lisbon. I wish I was in Lisbon though, but Brisbane is still nice. It's still nice and sunny up here in the north of Queensland, in the south of Queensland, in the north of Australia. But literally kicked off the book tour yesterday, and it was amidst the worst possible conditions because I had food poisoning the night before. I was up until 6 a.m. Got about 1 hour sleep, but like entrepreneurship, sometimes you need to push forward even though the conditions aren't the best, and you just need to keep moving forward, and that's what I did. So It went well nonetheless.
Good. So this is your book, Employee to Entrepreneur: How to Earn Your Freedom and Do Work That Matters. So this is such an important topic for my listeners, and I do quite a lot of work within business schools, and a lot of their MBAs and also their executive MBAs generally are really interested at some point in setting up their own business. And I've looked at your background, and you've got a strong background in entrepreneurship, and I'm particularly interested in your startup that was Hot Desk, yes?
Correct, yes.
Really interested in that. So there's so many questions I don't really know where to start. So I'm going to start with that. Let's start with your background and how you came to write the book.
Sure. So, my background, I spent almost a decade in the corporate world working for brands like Ernst & Young and KPMG, and I understand you yourself, Jane, worked for PwC as well in recruitment, and also spent time with investment banks like Macquarie Bank. So my background, as far as qualifications are concerned, although I would say that those qualifications and what I do today are diametrically opposed. So I had a master's in accounting of all things, and now I'm working in the entrepreneurial space. So they're very, very different. But after about almost a decade in the space, I found that even though I had what some may call the trappings of success, even though I had the six-figure salary, the business class flights around the world, the corporate junkets and all that fun stuff, part of me was somewhat unfulfilled. And I say in the book, I was comfortably miserable in a way.
Yeah.
And I found myself living for the weekend, drinking a lot, and doing all the sort of stuff you do in your 20s when you're not really that content with work, and you also suffer from Mondayitis and all that sort of stuff. And I guess it was in the most unlikely of places that inspiration struck, and that was in an empty office space. So working in the Big Four, I found that there was a hell of a lot of vacant space wherever I went. And like every second person in the startup ecosystem and their dog, I decided I'd build a marketplace, or an Airbnb for office space as it was, called
Great.
Hotdesk. Yeah, to connect the vacant office space with freelancers, early stage startups, people who are just traveling business people. Um,
Mm,
and that was Hotdesk, right? And the thing about Hotdesk was it didn't cost me tens of thousands of dollars and years of my time. Within a few months and about $2,000, and thanks to an Airbnb script and a web developer I found on freelancer.com, I was able to put together a simple prototype. And that prototype enabled you to list space, search space rather, um, upload photos, purchase, transact online, all that sort of good stuff. And ultimately, I figured, okay, I've got a prototype. Now I need somebody to actually know about it. So I naively, somewhat, Googled how to write a press release and tried my hand at writing one, and then sent it to about 100 journalists whose emails I found via Twitter. And of those 100 journalists, how many do you think actually got back to me, Jane?
I know because I've read the bit of that book.
Ah,
One.
one, yes. So one got back to me, but it just so happened to be a journalist from the Australian, which is one of our biggest newspapers down under. And that got picked up in the Macquarie News. I was working for the bank at the time, and my manager tapped me on the shoulder asking me, hey, what's this hot desk stuff all about? And I had to assure him that it was just a little side project, which in fairness it was at the time. But that article then got the interest of investors. 3 months later, they decided to invest about 150,000 Australian dollars into the business. And I thought, well, I'm going to go off and spend a year doing this and see what happens. And it's been about 6 or 7 years since, and I haven't looked back.
And so you haven't sold the business. You've kind of developed the business, as I understand it.
Well, I think one thing I talk about in the book is that oftentimes in entrepreneurship, you won't have the answers from day one, what the perfect idea is. You basically need to go on the journey for the answers to present themselves. And I spent about 2 years building out Hotdesk. Building out the supply side was really easy. I had about 13,000 spaces on it across Asia Pac. But
Mm-hmm.
then the demand side was a lot more challenging. And one of the biggest challenges with that kind of platform was people would use the platform to find, say, a working space. But then if they liked it, they would negotiate directly with the vendor to stay on longer. Whereas Airbnb works because when you use an Airbnb, you don't book a week, say, in San Francisco and say, quite like this place. I think I'm going to buy it. Nobody does that. So
Yeah.
the platform was flawed in a way. But during that 2-year period, I learned a hell of a lot. I met a lot of people and I identified an opportunity to take what I had learned about startup methodologies and bring that back into the corporate world where I'd spent about 10 years. And that became Collective Campus, which is our corporate innovation and startup accelerator that we've worked with close to 60 big brands now all over the world, and we've incubated close to 100 startups, basically operating at the intersection of corporate innovation and the startup ecosystem. And that is performing an order of magnitude better than Hotdesk ever did. But I wouldn't have identified the opportunity if I hadn't gone on that journey in the first place.
Yeah. And I think obviously you talk about that in the book, and obviously that's now doing kind of 7 figures and doing really well. And what are your plans for that? Are you going to continue to grow that, or will you look for an exit at some point?
I think we will continue to grow it for the indefinite future. However, one thing we've done with Collective Campus is we're spinning off companies as we go. So one of
Mhm.
our organizations is Lemonade Stand, which is a children's entrepreneurship program. I'm very encouraging of my team whenever they come up with an idea to find a quick, cheap, easy way to test it. And that was
Yeah.
one idea whereby I said, we don't know anything about working with kids, but hey, you spend $100 testing that idea. All they did was set up an Eventbrite page with some simple curriculum about what the workshop would look like. They spent $100 on Facebook ads targeting people who like mum blog
Oh
pages
yeah.
on Facebook, so young
Yeah.
mums essentially. And for $100, we got about 200 clicks, 10% conversion rate, so 20 tickets sold at about $400. So that $100 got us $8,000 in return. And so we ran the class, and since that first class of 20 kids, we've run it for another 1,000 kids, and we're now turning that into an online platform that will be scaling across Australia this year and then hopefully around the world. And that's just an example where while we're working on Collective Campus, we are spinning off organizations like that. And we've also raised just over $2 million late last year for a company called Concrete, which is our blockchain-enabled share registry, which is basically something we've built to tokenize shares, where you make shares in any type of asset a lot more liquid via the blockchain. So that's what keeps me excited, because I guess I get bored if I'm always doing the same thing. I need to be exploring different things. At the same time, there's something to be said about not spreading yourself too thin. So that's something I'm cognizant of as well.
But actually, you've kind of created the perfect job for yourself in a way, because I think, you sound like, you like to have, you're interested in lots of different things, and therefore you're interested in incubating different businesses and starting businesses. So in a way, you've kind of created your perfect job.
Yeah, and definitely. I mean, and we run accelerator programs as well, where I get to work with other entrepreneurs and work on their business models and see them, their ideas come to fruition. I get to host a podcast, which is now over 300 episodes in, and write books. So that definitely gives the podcast is called Future Squared is the podcast, and I've had such a star-studded array of guests on that show. Annie Duke.
It's very ambitious.
yeah, team. Amazing. And yeah, that just gives the creative side of myself an outlet as well. So yeah, in many ways, I've created the perfect job for myself, where I get to speak with wonderful people like yourself as well, and other podcasts. And yeah, it's been great. But again, it wasn't something that I envisaged from day one, that I'm going to build this business where I get to write books and host a podcast and spin off businesses. It kind of happened organically in a way, just by taking that step.
So your book, how would you describe it, and why did you write it?
I wrote it because in my work with Collective Campus, we work with a lot of large organizations on their innovation strategies, a lot of people that are employed by large companies. And when they learn about my story, oftentimes they ask, well, how can I do that as well? I've got all these ideas, but I'm scared to make the leap. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't think it's the right time. Are there any ways I can do it without quitting my job? Is it really for me? Like, these are the big questions that I often get asked. And I found myself answering these questions for a lot of different people, and thought, well, there's definitely something here. And I knew that over 50% of people, or close to 50% of people in the US, Australia, I think the UK, it's similar, are dissatisfied at work and are exploring entrepreneurship as a potential alternative. So it just made sense to me to write this book, but also to write it from the perspective of someone who did spend a decade in the corporate world, who was in many ways, I guess you could say, institutionalized, and had certain behaviors drilled into me that don't really support entrepreneurship. From the perspective of someone making that leap, I think it's different to other books on the market that talk to you about, or that try to sell the idea of becoming an entrepreneur, because it explores what are those corporate behaviors that hold you back, such as voracious planning, research, analysis. They all serve a purpose up to a point, but I should do it from this side. Anything serves a purpose up to a point, but you get the benefit here. But if you plan too much, then the benefit tapers off. It's like that inverted U concept. And I find that a lot of the stuff we pick up in the corporate world actually inhibits people when they jump out on their own, because they want certainty. They want everything to just make sense before they jump out. But the key difference between the corporate world and the startup world is, in the corporate world, you've got an existing business model that makes sense. You've got certainty around what your product is, who your customers are. In the startup world, you haven't got a business model when you start out. You've got total uncertainty around your customers, what the product is. And so you need to get more adept at exploration and moving quickly. And once you figure all that stuff out, then you can start to exploit and bring on some more of those corporate attributes in terms of how you manage the delivery of that business model.
Absolutely. I mean, I was ill over Christmas, so I'm afraid I didn't read all your book, but I've had a look through it, and I was thinking, I wish I hadn't been ill, because I would have been able to finish it. But I will finish it, and I will definitely write you a review. But it seemed to me that it was basically, everything that you've learned, because I think one of the things being an entrepreneur, and I speak for my clients and myself, you sometimes get a bit overwhelmed. there's so much information out there that it's really difficult to distill what is it that you need to focus on and what are the things you need to think about, especially if you've not done it before.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And that's something that I've tried to do with this book, is to distill everything I've learned. I've read at least 200 books on entrepreneurship, but then I've read a lot of books on, say, philosophy, mindset, psychology, which is just as, if not more important in some respects when it comes to entrepreneurship, because you might have a great idea, a great team, you might be technically gifted, but if you haven't got your head screwed on right, and at the first sign of difficulty, you cave, then you're not going to play the long game, and you need to play the long game as an entrepreneur. I think it was Calvin Coolidge, the American president, who said, nothing in the world will take the place of persistence. Talent will not, genius will not, education will not. The world is full of educated people who amounted to nothing. Persistence alone trumps all. And so the book, hundreds of books, 7 years in this space, working with almost 100 startups, listen to hundreds of podcast episodes. So basically everything you need to know about sales, marketing, coming up with your idea, mindset, building your team, 10xing your productivity, all of that is distilled into about 280 pages in this book.
Which is great, because most people don't have time to read all those different books on different areas, and you just get a bit overwhelmed and exhausted really with reading into those different areas. So I think when you're starting out, certainly until you know what you need to focus on, this sounds really, really good. And actually, even as somebody, I've been doing my own thing for 20 years, there are things that I'm learning in here, because it's your business changes, and my own business is now changing. I've got a new project that I'm looking at, and that's bringing up quite a lot of questions. And so at any stage in your business, you're looking to solve different problems or take it to a different level. So I think it's unusual to find it all in one book, and I think that's a real unique selling point for your book. So it must have taken you a long time to write it, I thought, as we started to read it.
Funnily enough, I actually went to Thailand for a couple of weeks last summer, and I spent about 5 hours a day writing, because I feel like you can only really get into that deep work state for about 4 to 5 hours. The rest of the time I'd be at the beach or in Muay Thai classes and things like that. And over the period of that 2 weeks, I wrote about 50,000 words. And so the book is 75,000 words. So that was 2/3 of it down. However, then there was a lot of, say, tweaking and iterating of that initial 50,000, and a lot of back and toing and froing with the copywriter at the publisher. But I would say that it was pretty, let's just say I had expectations that it would be a lot more burdensome on me and on my business than it was. So yeah, I'll take that as a compliment.
Going back to people thinking of coming out of corporate, I think one of the major challenges is looking at how to fund your business. There are so many different ways, and ways that just weren't very popular or even unheard of, things like crowdfunding. It's quite difficult to work out which is the right way to fund your business. And in the UK, we've got different ways to do that. We've got community interest companies, we've got shares companies guaranteed, and different types of legal vehicles. And I know this is a bit kind of generic, but can you give some advice, because I know you do cover some of this in the book, about what to think about in terms of how you fund your business?
Sure. I think the first thing to think about is really being objective around whether you need funding, because most entrepreneurs I see in the space who are starting out, they conflate funding with market validation and with success, because they read TechCrunch and Mashable and they think, well, we need to raise millions of dollars, we need to become a unicorn and things to that effect. But if you look for funding from day one, that means that if you do raise, you'll raise at a lower valuation because you probably haven't got revenue yet. You'll give away a bigger slice of your business, and you'll raise from less sophisticated investors. If you focus on your value proposition and getting your product to a point where it is actually making money, you've got customers, and if and only if you need that capital to scale, then you want to pursue funding. At that point, because you have a business, you're making money, you'll raise at a higher valuation, give away less of your business, and also access more sophisticated investors with networks, talent, and expertise to help you scale that business. You want to be wary as well of just raising money for the sake of it, because you may fall victim to things like liquidation preferences, which is something that some venture capitalists put into term sheets, whereby if you exit your business, they'll get, say, $3 or $4 on every dollar they invested before you see a single cent. So you could work really hard and have very little to show for it at the end of the day. But apart from that, you definitely want to, in the early stages, like angel investors, friends and family, that's where you want to go. As your business gets to beyond, say, the 1 million to 2 million valuation, then you start looking at venture capitalists. And these days, there's also alternative funding mechanisms, whether it's equity crowdfunding, whether it's funding via, say, the blockchain. I mean, ICOs aren't really a thing now, but there are other things you can do in that space to raise funding, particularly if you are a blockchain-enabled business. But don't take it lightly, and make sure that if you do raise funding, if you absolutely need it, that you get a lawyer on board who has worked with startups and understands what the pitfalls are, because you definitely don't want to fall into one of those pitfalls unknowingly and then find yourself 5 years later, after having worked so hard on your business, with little to show for it.
Yeah, definitely. And do you have anything to say on crowdfunding particularly?
I mean, crowdfunding, in terms of equity crowdfunding, I think that there are a number of platforms. I'm not sure what the platforms are in the UK at the moment, but I know in Australia and New Zealand, you have Equitize is one of them. The beauty of those platforms is you can raise capital and still maintain a lot of control, because you may raise, say, $1 million, but from, say, 1,000 investors who put in $1,000 each. So they haven't really got a massive say in terms of where that business goes. So that's definitely a big benefit there. At the same time, it could be a curse, because they're not going to really be able to help
Well, you've
his experience, having worked with hundreds of startups, could.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, that's really useful. And you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but I know quite a lot of MBAs that will be listening will want to ask this question. So when you said you got funding for Hotdesk, what kind of did you have to give equity away? And are you able to say kind of?
Yeah, no, totally. And I would say that I'm very open, Jane. So I would say that if I had to do it again, I probably would look for other funding mechanisms, because I was relatively naive and green as far as entrepreneurship went at the time. So I raised $156,000 for about 25%, which essentially valued my business at just over $600,000, which isn't a lot. But it wasn't really that. It was the fact that I raised from people who were great. Their hearts were in the right place. And if it wasn't for that investment, maybe I'd be doing something totally different now. But didn't really have the domain expertise or the networks in the space that I was working in to really support me. So that's a mistake I made in one sense, but in the same sense, it did give me the opportunity to explore Hotdesk and open doors to what I'm doing now. So I'm not sure I'd take it back after all.
Very good. Yeah, and I suppose once you've got proof of concept and you've scaled to a certain amount, you can be more strategic about approaching particular investors who can really catapult your business forward, because it's not just about the money, it is about their networks, their reach, depending on what your business is and what you want to achieve.
Exactly. And if you're thinking about leaving, say, the corporate world, for example, to start your own thing, and one of your reasons for doing so is that you don't like authority, you don't like being accountable to other people, well, then guess what? You're now accountable to investors. So if you want control, it's perhaps not the best way to go.
Yeah, brilliant. And in terms of your book, if you had to take, say, 3 things from your book that you think, if you read this book, I really want you to take these 3 things away from your book, what would you say that they are?
Great question. Putting me on the spot. I love it. I think that the first thing would be just around whether entrepreneurship is right for you, and whether you are exploring this for the right reasons. I have a chapter in the book that looks at alternatives to entrepreneurship. And if you're dissatisfied at work, if you don't like your boss, if you wish you were paid more, if you don't like the nature of the work you're doing, entrepreneurship isn't necessarily the answer, because as Laurie Greiner put it, the Shark Tank judge, entrepreneurs will quit a $80,000 a year, 40-hour-a-week job to work 80 hours a week for $40,000 a year, right? And that's not an easy solution to your problems. A solution could be getting a job somewhere else, making a lateral move in the same organization, getting upskilled in a particular area and opening new career opportunities, joining a startup that's established and has funding and is growing.
Absolutely.
there's so many things, and maybe even taking up a hobby on the side, because maybe that creative side of yourself just isn't being satisfied at the moment, right?
I think that's a really good point, and I think that the piece about being creative about the companies maybe you might go and work for, like going to work for a startup, or looking at VCs and seeing what companies they're funding, so they're at a reasonable level so that they can afford to pay you a reasonable amount. Because, you know, especially if you're coming out of corporate, you're probably used to quite a big salary. You don't want to go and work in a really tiny startup with no money, for maybe even if you get equity, but it could be that actually your outgoings are so much that you just can't do that. But there are plenty of fast growing companies that are interesting, but I think often people think of the same names that they know to think about working for. So I think that's a great idea, and I think, you know, some people it isn't right for them to run their own company, and it's not going to work for them. So that's really good.
100%. And some people actually have a biological predisposition away from entrepreneurship. There's been studies performed where certain people have a very hyperactive amygdala, so that fight or flight sensing part of our brain. Whenever there is an inkling of risk in their periphery, that just lights up like a Christmas tree, and they just, you know, tense up like a deer in the headlights. And if that's you, then you're probably not going to make a great entrepreneur. And one way you can determine that is, how have you demonstrated a strong relationship with adversity in the past? Where have you been knocked down and kept getting up? Or did you get knocked down and say, oh, I don't like the way this makes me feel, I'm going to go and sit down and have a pina colada or something like that, right? So there's certain things that are telltale signs as to whether or not you are biologically predisposed to being an entrepreneur. But the other two, real quick, would be one, experimentation, and not just experimentation when it comes to figuring out your product, your business model, but everyday experimentation. I mean, we at Collective Campus, for example, when it came to marketing strategies, we've got a Google sheet with hundreds of things that we've tried, but it's literally, in some cases, it could be a 1-day experiment, a 3-day experiment. Run it quickly, learn what works, learn what doesn't, and move forward. The faster you get at learning which sales strategy, which marketing strategy, which customer segment, which business model, price point, etc. works, the more likely you will be to succeed. So the book packs a lot of punches in terms of how you effectively go about experimenting by focusing on the high impact and very uncertain parts of your business. And then the final thing I would say is, and I wrote a Harvard Business Review article about this called The Case for the 6-Hour Workweek recently, and it's 10xing your productivity, because so many entrepreneurs will get busy being busy and doing all of the little non-consequential things that don't actually move the needle on their business. If anything is a process, if anything is rudimentary, where you can put it into a step-by-step formula, either you want to turn that into an automation of some kind, so using an algorithm tool, or you want to outsource it to a virtual assistant of some kind. You should just be focused on those high value tasks that are aligned to your strengths, where you can create the most value. Anything else is basically sacrificing whether or not your business, compromising to a degree whether or not your business will be successful or not.
And I think on that last point, it's really important, and it's probably one of the biggest hurdles to get over. Certainly I've had that hurdle where you think, well, especially in the early stages, can I really afford to somebody else to do my books or somebody else to do my admin? But actually it will hold you back, and it's false economy in a way, because the more you do that, the less you're doing sales and marketing and the stuff only you can do. But I think it's often a balance of, do I invest in somebody doing these things, but you have to in a way to move forward.
Yeah, there's a great book on this called 80-20 Sales and Marketing by Perry Marshall, and I also refer to this in the book, again, distilling it all down into the one book, where he talks about $10 an hour tasks, $100 an hour tasks, $1,000 an hour tasks, and anything that's a $10 an hour task, you should be outsourcing or automating that. Like, that's not what you're paid to do, and that's not what you've been trained to do, and you absolutely cannot afford not to do that, I would say, if you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, brilliant. Sounds great. Well, look, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and talking about your book. So it's out tomorrow. So do you know when it's going to be on Amazon?
Yeah. So it'll be on Amazon.com.uk.au, all over the world, and it should be in a number of physical, good old-fashioned bricks and mortar bookstores as well.
Brilliant. And we'll put all the links on our website to the book and to your website. And I will also, because I feel really bad I haven't finished your book because I was ill, I will send a copy of your book to one of our readers. So all you need to do is just follow us on Instagram under the Career Farm. Just tag someone that you think would be really appreciate this book, and then I will send that out, and I'll send it out wherever that person is in the world. So because you kindly sent me 2 copies, actually. I don't know if you knew that, Steve.
Oh.
So I'm going to send one out to a listener, and I'm going to keep one.
Fantastic.
And we'll do that tomorrow, because it actually launches tomorrow properly, which is fortuitous. It's my birthday as well, so
happy birthday.
It'll be lucky, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Really interesting to hear your journey, and I think it's quite unusual to hear a story and also hear the learning and all the things that you've learned. And I think it's really good to have it in one book, because it's really difficult. I don't even see in my office. Those are all,
Wow.
How can you read all those and distill that? So you've done all the hard work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thanks for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Good luck with the rest of your book tour.
Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much, Steve. The show notes from today, we're making them a bit briefer actually recently, as we're spending quite a lot of time doing the show notes and not much time actually promoting it. So they're a bit shorter, but they're at thecareerfarm.com/pod92. So that's thecareerfarm.com/pod92. And we'll put the links on how to find Steve's book and how to find out a bit more information about Steve. So thank you very much. Fantastic. So until next month, have a great month. And thank you very much for listening. Okay, goodbye.